So, Leeann Culbreath is a priest in the Diocese of Georgia, where she founded and leads the Creation Care Commission there. For the past 6 years, she has catalyzed local, statewide, and national efforts to abolish immigrant jails and accompany those harmed by the detention system in their journeys of freedom and justice. She also co-facilitates for the Episcopal Migration Ministry, Asylum, and Detention Ministry Network. That's a mouthful. Um, and serves on the steering committee for Georgia Detention Watch. So her environmental activism began in childhood, where she saved money from her newspaper route to help save the endangered California condor. She will be talking to you at that intersection. So that's what's going to be interesting about this tonight, I think. So in that, you saw both this liberation and justice and jailing, detention and all that business, and environmentalism. So that's where she will be calling you to attune. So Leeann, with that, I'll invite you to share and begin.
Okay. Let's see. All right. Can you hear me and can you see the slide? Okay, great. Well, good evening, everybody. I can't see everybody right now through my screen, but because I have the slides up, but I'm really glad that you're all here. Very honored to be asked to present a webinar for Deep Green Faith, Center for Deep Green Faith, and excited about their new ministry and how that's going to evolve over time. The ideas I'm sharing tonight, this intersection, are still very much evolving, coming together. This is the first time that I've actually made these connections publicly and tried to pull these ideas together. And I'm grateful for the center for giving me a deadline. Sometimes you just need a deadline to actually do the hard work that you've been wanting and needing to do. And so I've done that, and I hope that it is helpful for you and for your ministries, present and future. So I submitted the description for the workshop about a month ago. And when I did, it was a little more theoretical in the description. And what's emerged since then is something a little more practical and inspirational, I hope. So I will still get nerdy and wordy in part of it. So if you came for that, I'll give you some fun things to chew on and some new big Scrabble words. But I also want to make this relevant to what you are doing on the ground, literally, or in the water, or in this, in the atmosphere, whatever you're doing in your ministries. So I assume that you all have been, are, or will be involved in some sort of creation care ministry. And by that, I'm defining that as ministries that tend, heal, nurture, and build relationship with non-human creation and or pursue ecological justice. So when I say creation care, I'm lumping eco-justice into that as well, just to save on words. And so I assume you have also experienced how challenging it can be to launch and sustain creation care ministry. Am I right? Any nods? Anyone experience that? We want humans to change behavior, to stop harming creation, and mostly they don't. And so the struggle is real. And there are many possible reasons for this lackluster responses to creation care initiatives. But I think a big one is that ministry leaders and ministries lack a clear and a compelling why for their ministry, WHY. So I want to focus this precious piece of time that we have together on why. Oh, there's the word. And my purpose in this webinar is to deepen and broaden the why of creation care ministry, to offer you a new framework for building more sustainable, transformational, hopeful, joyful, and effective ministries in an increasingly challenging time. So why start with why? The phrase "start with why" is something I've sort of latched onto, and I first sort of heard it in a context of organizational development from a book by Simon Sinek, who wrote a book called "Start with Why," and it's really a book on corporate leadership. It's talking more about how to build effective companies and sell your products, but he makes the important point that having clarity about an organization's why and maintaining that clarity and communicating it well gives it power and a much better chance at being effective and sustainable. He says, hold on a second. I'm going to have to go back. Okay, sorry. He says, there are only two ways to influence human behavior. You can manipulate it or you can inspire it. Here we go. Why start with why? A clear and compelling why inspires. Manipulating behavior with fear, guilt, shame, or punitive measures can affect short-term changes, but generally it's not successful long-term, and it's not a loving way or dignified way to treat other people. Social and environmental movements in the church and larger world often rely on manipulation, though sometimes that's very subtle. Think about some of the messages that church groups use to try to engage people in creation care initiatives. There's the Genesis story. God told Adam and Eve to be stewards, so we should be stewards too. And that's an obligation motivation. If we don't care for the earth, we and our kids and our grandkids will suffer. So there's a fear, appeal to fear. Our kids and grandkids will look back and resent how wasteful we were. And that's an appeal to shame. I'm so wasteful, but I'll feel a little bit better if I give to this really good environmental cause. And that's a guilt action. So these messages all hold some truth for sure, but do they inspire hopeful, joyful, and sustainable ministry or transformative change? From my experience, I say that they do not. And so creation care initiatives often struggle. They get sidelined, they have to compete for attention and possibly funding with other issues that are seen as separate issues and a higher priority than creation care. And then the well-meaning people who are called to this ministry, like you folks, can get frustrated and overwhelmed and burnt out, and that's understandable. Whys that grow out of fear and guilt and shame, etc., are dead ends. They are weak whys that do not reflect God's promises. So if we want to change human behavior, to inspire fellow Christians and everyone else to change behavior and participate in care for creation, we followers of Jesus need a why that is relational, hopeful, generative and not reactive, collaborative and synergistic, joyful and renewing, inclusive of all creation, all humans and all non-human matter. And I think most importantly, the why should be aligned with what God is already doing and grounded in God's promises for the reign of God, for the new creation. So in my however many years, decades of environmental and social movements, from trying to save the California condor when I was little, and a nature club when I was young, and different movements in college, I've just always been attracted to environmental activism and social justice. I've I've tried out different whys. I think I've been motivated by different types of whys, but I've been searching for a why, this kind of why that I just sort of outlined for a long time. And it was born out of tensions and questions that emerged through lived experiences in both the creation care ministry and an immigrant detention ministry, which I've been part of locally and at the national level and the state level for about 6 or 7 years now. And I experienced that ministries are often siloed. So I have a picture here of grain silos to give just a visual representation that there's not an easy way for collaboration between ministries, I have noticed. And often ministries in the church are in competition with each other, as I mentioned before, for funding, for volunteers, for exposure. I myself compartmentalized the creation care and immigration ministries. I didn't see ways that those were really connected, and I kind of did those as two different things. Another tension that I lived with or have lived with in recent years is time and energy that are limited. So there's a picture in the upper right of a calendar, just to symbolize how little time we have and how we need to use it well. And different ministries were often competing for my time and attention. And I found it was hard to do either of them very well, with my energy going in multiple directions in response to two different issues that were increasingly dire. And then in the bottom right-hand corner, there's a picture of a dump truck on a landfill. And that's just to lead into some intersections that I began to notice in my work, where these two issues and ministries were coming together, and how I was grappling with that. So I noticed that the immigrant detention centers in Georgia are located in counties with serious environmental problems, all of them. There's toxic coal ash dumping in a landfill, arsenic in the water system. In Stewart County, Georgia, where one of the nation's largest and notoriously abusive immigrant detention centers sits adjacent to a county landfill, there is also a stunning canyon that was formed by severe soil erosion in the 19th century. And the canyon formed in just a few decades after slaveholding farm plantation owners improperly managed the land for monoculture cotton farming, which was obviously done by slaves. When I visited people in the detention centers, they complained about the water, how it tasted and what it looked like, and they had no alternatives for water. They also routinely complained about skin issues, about rashes and lesions. And it seemed then to me that these rural communities where the detention centers were located were sites of historically of extractive economies, natural resources, and also enslaved human labor, and also sites of dumping of toxic waste, but also human beings that our society is deemed toxic or unwanted. These were truly disturbing parallels for me that challenged those neat compartments. And so I began to see how the work of those two ministries might impact each other and could be synergistic. So long story short, in time and through challenging conversations and experiences and reading, I became painfully aware of the forces of evil and destruction and division all around me, and how so many friends, people I knew, especially detained friends in the immigrant detention center, suffered multiple injustices simultaneously. And though I rejoiced with detained friends if they were released from detention, and I referred to that as a liberation, it became more and more clear to me that my vision of liberation was very small. And it would take much more healing and fighting for a life of real freedom for these friends. I started paying closer attention to visions or examples of liberation in the scriptures and realized how central this theme is throughout the scriptures. It's kind of the theme and not just some disembodied spiritual liberation. Through Jesus's death and resurrection, God is liberating all of creation. The process is already underway and we get to participate in it until God completes it. So liberation has become my core why and vision for ministry, and it checks all the components that I listed earlier. Now I don't think of ministries in terms of separate compartments. Rather, all of them are efforts that are life-giving and liberatory in some way, and are just different ways to participate in God's large ongoing work of liberation. All such efforts are important and significant and moving in the same direction, though at times some might be more urgent because of imminent harm, some may be more visible than others, and that's okay. So what do I mean when I say liberation? There are different ways to define it, but this is sort of what I've landed on. There's a liberation from and a liberation to. So liberation from forces of sin and death, personal and systemic, that oppress and harm and divide God's creatures. Liberation to a form of beloved community in a very broad sense of all of creation and reconciled relationship with each other and with God. It's a community or liberation of wholeness. And it's when all creatures are free to be what they were created to be and free to do what they were created to do. Now, you may be thinking of liberation theology, and I'd say this is kind of a newer iteration of a liberation theology that emerged in the 60s. This is kind of a different take on it, though, as well, but I don't really have time to get into that, but maybe some of you will have some connections to share later. And I believe that prison abolition, which I'm going to talk about next, is necessary work toward this kind of liberation that I have defined here. I'm going to grab a sip of water. So abolition, modern day abolition is a movement to defund and dismantle the entire carceral system. And by that, I mean police, prisons, detention centers, all forms of surveillance and confinement. You may also hear of the carceral system, the system of incarceration, as the prison industrial complex, PIC or PIC for short. And that means a vast system of government and corporate structures and policies that proliferate the use of violence for social control. And so some of the goals or of abolition, of the modern abolition movement, prison abolition movement, is divesting from the entire ideology of punishment, which they say is at the core of most violence, and especially at the core of racialized violence, and replacing whole systems rather than trying to reform, because the systems are violent at the core and cannot be truly reformed. Abolition seeks to replace these systems with resources and systems that address the roots of harm and offer nonviolent, relationship-based accountability processes. Abolition is building toward a world in which everyone lives in dignity, everyone's needs are met, and systems of safety are created collectively in community. So this isn't about no safety or no accountability, anything goes, but it's a different way of arriving at safety, and that is true safety that actually keeps people safe. And it strives for restorative justice, focusing on relationships, on the need for repair when relationships are broken or violated. And so I see the abolition movement as very holistic. It digs into the common roots of social and individual struggles and envisions, I think, a bigger and interconnected picture of liberation. Abolition obviously requires a lot of creative imagination and relationship building over time. Now, I've been talking about abolition from how it's sort of defined in a secular movement, but I really appreciate this quote from Hannah Bowman, the founder and director of Christians for Abolition, who situates abolition in a Christian context. She says, prison abolition is more than a nice progressive cause. It's a proclamation of a resurrection way of living. It's a conscious decision to participate now in the coming kingdom of God. It's a witness to our future hope made present reality. Prison abolition is evangelism and a potent sign of our Christian hope. Okay, one more. It's good big Scrabble word, intersectionality. And we have to, this is just part of the mix. I don't think you can really talk about abolition and liberation without thinking also about intersectionality. This is a contemporary Black feminist framework or metaphor for understanding how one's social identities like race and class, gender, sexual orientation, ability, location, culture, immigration status, healthcare and food access, et cetera, can create layers of structural violence and marginalization, making those persons more vulnerable to injustice and harm. Now, this isn't a brand new concept. You could trace it back to lots of different indigenous cultures and early history in the United States and the world. So it was not new, but in a couple of decades ago, a law professor, Kimberly Crenshaw, sort of elevated the idea of intersectionality and applied it in a legal context. And then it has been used and brought into social movements since then. She or they, whatever, intersectionality purports that single axis analysis and movements erase identities and experiences, which means ones that, analysis or movements that only look at one of those identities or one of those oppressive forces or symptoms, and doesn't look at any of the other ones that may be present. It erases somebody's full identity and their full experience, and it makes systemic change nearly impossible. Looking at social issues through an intersectional prism increases the possibilities for transformation and liberation. Social movements are often, sadly, single axis movements or analysis focused on just one issue or one particular group, one type of injustice. So intersectional resistance would, in the form of nonviolent movements, alliances, initiatives, ministries, whatever you want to call it, can break open that stranglehold of myriad harmful systems that constrains people and communities, including non-human communities, and create powerful possibilities for creative transformation and liberation. An example from that's helpful, I found in a 2014 article by Hania Balalia, who's a climate justice and migrant rights defender and educator. She says, let's look at how land defense and land reclamation movements grow out of an intersectional analysis. The issue of inequality in land ownership exists because of multiple intersectional oppressions. Colonialism, which is the theft and appropriation of lands, relies on white supremacy. Ideas like manifest destiny, which teach that the white race deserves these lands. The resulting inequality in land ownership has led to the ecological destruction of whole swaths of lands and the acceleration of climate change. In response, land defense and land reclamation movements that support the struggle of Native nations for sovereignty and the right to self-determination offer a path to fight climate change while also dismantling colonialism and white supremacy at the same time. And I would add that what Belalya does not mention is that these movements can liberate non-human creatures and ecological systems that have suffered harm as well. The Coombe River Collective, a Black feminist collective that formed in the 1970s, said in their statement that major systems of oppression are interlocking. So it's another way of thinking of it. And to break open interlocking systems of oppression, this is my words, these are my words, we need strong, interlocking, interconnected movements for liberation. In my view, prison abolition is one type of intersectional resistance that can catalyze liberation for both oppressed humans and for non-human creation. It is connected easily to creation care. So I want to think about strands and not silos. What if we started thinking about treating various ministries in the church as unique strands of yarn or thread, each helping to create something new and beautiful? Each effort, each ministry that is oriented toward the reign of God, no matter how big or small, is an essential strand in the masterpiece that God is creating. The image I've been holding for that masterpiece, this is just a picture of a tapestry, some kind of a woven tapestry, is a hand-woven tapestry. It's a metaphor that helps me visualize the big L liberation. And in the reign of God, there is no injustice or oppression, no interlocking harmful systems that constrain God's creatures. Instead, there are vibrant strands spun with love and hope and passion, and they are woven by God into designs and pictures of God's grand vision for the liberation of all creation. We on earth can only see little bits of the tapestry now and can only imagine how vast and beautiful it will be. If multiple strands are twisted or braided together, how much more intricate and colorful will the tapestry be? And how do some colors woven next to others set off other colors in a new way? Interwoven, collaborative liberation is what God is already doing, and it is a blessing to get to join in on it. And this is not exactly the photo that I had in mind for the metaphor, but it's what I could find on Pixabay, so I went with it. It was the free photo. All right, so apply the why. How could we apply this why that I've presented, a why of liberation? So a couple ideas I have, and I'm eager to hear yours. Follow your joy, ministries that nurture wholeness in you. That is where liberation is already at work, where the Holy Spirit is already active. To collaborate, to look for opportunities for synergistic ministry, for alliances. In the words of abolitionist author and activist Mariame Kaba, nothing we do that is worthwhile is done alone. Honestly assess your ministry or organization's multiple axes of privilege and discrimination and how they impact the power dynamics in your efforts, because they do. Get imaginative about church ministry budgets, about grants, how you approach those, who you include in them, what gets lumped together. Create nurturing and safe spaces for persons with intersectional identities in your work and center their voices and needs and visions. And focus as much or more on how you do ministry as well as what you do. Give time to build relationships, to build community, to build trust. Another saying in abolition circles and emergent strategy is we move forward at the speed of trust. These are essential to liberatory movements. We have to be the liberation that we wish to see in our own organizations and ministries. In her book, We Do This Till We Free Us, Kaba also says, our charge is to make imagining liberation under oppression completely thinkable, to really push ourselves to think beyond the normal order for us to be able to address the root causes of people suffering. The last slide. So what? Or moving into more of a conversation on what? Well, so what? With so many things that need to be done right now on this planet, is it really worth taking precious time to talk about a why, to pay attention to intersectionality, to nurture relationships, to create safe spaces, et cetera, et cetera? I think it's not only worth it, but it's crucial. Ministries and campaigns driven by a strong and clear why that tackle intersecting oppressions head on, wield a mighty and divine power to actualize justice and liberation, and thus reveal and experience God's reign in our midst. There is so much joy and hope and love, freedom in this kind of ministry. It can prevent the hopelessness, the burnout, fizzle out, and competition so many that are common in so many social and environmental movements. And then the final question is just what? What can this look like in the church and in community? What does it look like? What have you seen? What examples do you know of intersectional resistance, of liberatory, interconnected movements for liberation in your ministries? So I'll shift into conversation there. Welcome Jerry back to get us started. I'm going to stop share so we can see each other better.
Yeah, thank you, boy. We need a weekend.
Yeah, I know. It is a retreat, but yeah, that's a lot
Yeah,
to
and
say.
I hope there was a lot of uh, connection. So this what I think we got to explore is okay, how much of this is resonating and how much of it is just kind of like, whew. Right. So I would assume that there's a bit of both. The chat has been quiet. Now is the time for you to think out loud with the keyboard. The other thing you can do while we have these conversations is on the bottom of your Zoom screen where it lists all the things, right? Mute, video, polls, chat, share screen, so on and so forth. There's one called reactions. And if you click on reactions, one of the things you can do is raise your hand. It's the bottom, it's in text print. And what that does actually is it bumps your little Hollywood square up to the upper right, so we can see that you have raised your hand even if we've got more than one screen's worth of stuff. So it works really well. So there's that. So there's the chat and there's the hand raising, and we can use those tools. We've got a good half an hour for conversation. So I've been writing furiously, but we can let Joey start us off here, since his hand is up. Joey, what you got?
Thanks. First of all, I want to say to Leeann, strands, not silos, is genius. It's really pure genius. And it's a way not only to visualize, but in my work that I do, to communicate that, not being in a silo of creation care versus a silo of youth ministry versus a silo of racial healing. It's all strands. And what can we do working together? And what kind of picture will we create? The other thing that struck me just about this conversation is that this is exactly the way God created the earth, with so much diversity in such a way that everything works together, and it's been sustained on earth for over 4 billion years. And
Right.
we need to work like God created it, and get out of the silos and work with creation instead of, unfortunately, our behavior works against it. So anyway, thank you very much for strands, not silos.
Thank you, Joey. Appreciate that.
One thing that struck me is, and we can ask the group this and ask you this, Leanne. This is also true for deep green faith. We're starting to introduce different language than has commonly been used to engage and describe and to prescribe responses and reactions and naming of issues. And one of your big words is liberation. So I'm curious, have you ever heard the word used much in an environmental ministry or action context, where that word has been used as the clarion call for action? So yeah, let me ask you that first, Leanne, and then we can see if the group has a response.
I'm thinking. Maybe I don't know if I've heard it as a clarion call. No.
I mean, yeah, right. I mean,
there's always some conversation of all creation groans for, the liberation, that sort of Romans, I'm trying to remember the verse now, but
it's Romans 8. Yep.
Yeah. So there is a sense of, and loving, liberating, life-giving. Yeah. I'm trying to remember. I mean, creation care is the creation care ministry in the Episcopal Church does frame their work around loving, liberating, and life-giving. At least as I remember, like some of the paper, like some of the handouts I got at a Province 4 synod. So I think there is some use of it. I don't know how much of it is. I think most of it is geared toward liberation of humans and not necessarily liberation of all of creation.
Yeah, I think that's right.
That's an area that we can start to stretch. And
all right, I do think that's it. Yeah, exactly right. I think we do touch the word in eco-justice, but we do it by applying that justice to humans, and which is right. But it's just an interesting thought to say, if we're not siloing, if liberation is the work, then what is it to liberate creation? Which is that Romans 8. I mean, they groan, and as they wait for the redemption, as they wait for liberation, basically, is what that text is saying. So it struck me when you said that. I thought, I don't know if I can name where the word has been overtly used as a clarion call for creation care. Care itself is a very, it's a stewardship word, right? We either care about or we care for. That's the two assumptions of the word creation care. We are caring about or we're caring for. That's still short of the energy of a word like liberate. So yeah.
And creation, liberation.
Yeah, creation, liberation. Shake a fist.
There is more energy in it. It's a different kind of energy.
Yeah.
And
Yeah. Um,
Joey's asking, what about goals like net zero churches? Joey, do you want to
elaborate.
elaborate what you
Yeah,
mean
I
by?
guess I'll answer my own question. Net zero is a big issue right now. Getting to net zero, let's say by 2030 and no later than 2050. And I guess in answer to my own question about what that, using Leah's language, it's one of those strands that we can do as a church that will lead to liberation. You know, and it's a way of being loving, liberating, and life-giving to not only to ourselves but to all of creation. So, I mean, I think that's important. I guess what I'm saying is, once I start to separate net zero activities from everything else, then I get myself into a silo. I've got to be very careful about how I present and talk about that to other people.
Right, because net zero could be heard and experienced simply as a technical fix, right? That we need to manage our energy use to get to net zero to solve a problem. Now, would we ever use that same kind of approach and language to talk about human beings? And I would propose probably not. I mean, I guess you could have technical conversations about dismantling, the PIC, the prison industrial complex. You can talk about technologies of doing that, right? Like, oh, well, number one, you have to stop funding, you have to stop rewarding those things that perpetuate uh, systems of incarceration and rewarding people who think in terms of punishment and control, right? So, okay, there's a technical way to get at some of those things. But the mission, you don't want to sum up the mission as we need to be net zero. It's a result of the mission, not the naming of the mission, I guess is what I'm hearing now, Leanne, in the way that you're getting at the why, right? It begs a question. Why net zero? Why should we care? And you need to answer that question to get motivation around net zero. I guess that's kind of, I'm working like Leanne, I'm working the same thought process. I'm kind of like thinking out loud
Yeah.
about this.
What I'm wondering is if a way of doing that, or taking a more intersectional approach to a net zero church, would be to start to build relationships with people who are harmed by energy use in your area. Like, who is living next to a landfill where coal ash is being dumped? Who is affected in some other way? What does how can you help other under lesser resourced neighbors also reduce their energy bills? What kinds of collaborations could there be there to sort of put a human face on it, because that is helpful. It is hard to think about, okay, zero net energy, where's the emotion in that? And so, like, how do you start to engage people in a different way that will really keep them motivated? And usually it's because they have a relationship, they have connection with somebody who's impacted.
And then to continue the weaving, you went to human faces, which I get, right?
I know, yeah.
Because there's a great title of a book, I can't remember whose it was, but I've thought about it for decades, and until we have faces.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Until we have faces.
Lewis.
Yeah. So so part of the work of weaving this creation care wise is so that the non-human world also has a face.
Yes, yeah.
Now, the way that gets done in the environmental movement is through megafauna and megaflora. So the charismatic megafauna, like the polar bear, and the charismatic megaflora, like the redwoods, are an attempt to put a face on some of this. And now I think some of the theological work is to put the face of Jesus on some of this.
Mm-hmm.
And that work is being done. The like Sally McFaig and the creation as the body of God is in a way to say, even the mosquito bears the image of Christ kind of thing.
Right.
And that is I think it's a version of the same kind of work you're talking about. And that's what the intersectionality can help us do. It's what using energized terms like freedom and release of the captives. They're not just human captives. There's really in the Gospels, it's not, even release of the captives. In visions of Isaiah, you'll see it this Advent. Just read the Isaiah text this Advent that's coming up. About how the land will rejoice in the at what? At the coming of God.
Mm-hmm.
And
Right.
so the land rejoices at the coming of God, just like we in Advent anticipate. And we're previewing the next seminar, just as we anticipate the coming of God in Christ, so does creation, and for the same reasons. That kind of thing, right? So all we're doing here is we're putting the face of God. We're naming God into this stuff, for both enslaved humans and enslaved creation,
Mm-hmm.
I guess. And what we're arguing, I'm hearing you argue, is that this isn't just a sideline. This is critical work to get the church off its duff, to engage its heart and soul. I guess. So.
And it's critical spiritual work that draws us closer, deeper into life in Christ. It's an invitation, and that, and a pathway into a deeper relationship with God and deeper reconciliation with God. So it's not just a going, and doing something, but it is a way of experiencing God differently and profoundly.
Yeah, and that's to get us away from the wagging of the green finger and all the fear motivations that you had listed at the beginning of your talk. So it was a great list. I thought about asking you to re-pull the slide about the whys, and we had to sit there. I'm looking at. I think it's the same list: relational, hopeful and sustainable, generative, not reactive. How much energy do we spend trying to get people to be afraid of what's coming? That's reactive. And rather than generative, huh?
I'll copy and paste the list into the chat.
Oh, in the chat, yeah.
That would be great.
But just that generative, not reactive, is huge spiritual work that I think you're tapping into with this, right? That we care about people in prisons because we can see ourselves there. The harder work, I guess, is to see the face of Christ in all creation so that we will care there. And the invitation, you use the word several times, is an invitation to join in the mission for which we were created and put on the planet. The redemption of all things, the blessing of all living things, be fruitful and multiply, blessing that God gave to all things in the garden, and then made us in God's image and gave us that domain and told us to do the same. That is an invitation and an opportunity, not just a burden and a task. Ask any gardener; they'd probably tell you that. collaborative and synergistic. So this, right, so we're not in competition with, you know, and this is hard in churches, right? Because churches often do consider the green team as a competition. They see you as wanting to take church resources and apply them somewhere, rather than as a group that helps people's hearts enjoying the mission of God and to engage their faith in a way that makes them more Christian than they were. That it grows the church.
You'll have to unlock your device.
Stop.
Leanne, do you have any practical, like?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Yes, because this is something I have run up against time and time again. Just what Jerry's talking about, and what you hit on, and everyone's talking about the strands versus silos. Well, how do you weave the strands together? Because quite often I find, the people I encounter have limited energy. How do we frame this work or join it with the other efforts? Because typically what I hear is that addressing human needs takes priority, even if people care about creation, the rest of creation. So how do we tie these together so that they are seen as part of the same web?
Yeah, I mean, that's where imagination is still, I'm still figuring out what that looks like myself. But what it can look like what could it look like in the Episcopal Church to not silo ministries and to be more collaborative. And I was doing some work for a while on with Dr. Catherine Meeks with the Absalom Jones Center for Racial Healing in Atlanta, and having conversations about this, like, why are we not talking about immigration when we're talking about racial reconciliation? Why is this a separate, Episcopal migration ministries or whatever? This is a total separate thing, and it's not. And what are the possibilities of working together and of finding common, finding places where issues intersect. And that's where you can put limited energy into something where that will be more powerful and more effective in the long term. So your energy is being used better. But it would be finding, okay, are there ways in which in your sphere of influence, creation care is intersecting with that? Can you take care of human needs without caring for creation? If you really start to look at it, to analyze it, and to see what the different layers of oppression or harm are, can you and I was thinking about budgets. Like I'm wondering, imagining what budgets would look like if instead of having a separate budget for this priority and a separate budget and staff for this priority, and separate budget and staff for this priority, but that everyone is working toward a common vision, and you call it liberation or whatever, reign of God. And there is a sort of a lump sum for that, but there are three different ways of approaching that, or pathways, or focus points within it, but they're also weaving together their work and looking and taking the time to look at ways to do that differently. Instead of separating it out and going, okay, we just did something, and now what category do we assign that to? Was that creation care, or was that racial? I don't know. I mean, we were doing this in this neighborhood, or it could be just something like, I was thinking about like a lot of creation care ministries are related to food, gardening. And so there are already some intersectional ministries happening where that gardening is happening, maybe, either on church property in a way that is, invites those who don't have adequate access to food into the church garden, or maybe food is taken to under-resourced neighborhoods, and that's wonderful. Okay, so there's access to food, and you focused on the food piece. But what if you then find out that most of the people receiving the food are single mothers in government housing, and their ovens and their stoves don't work? They can't cook food. They can't cook anything, even if they know how to cook. And then working on that basic human need and justice issue of fighting for that basic human need of being able to cook food for your family, and have family meals and be able to provide a healthy meal and not have to rely on fast food in the neighborhood. So that would be an intersectional ministry, a way that creation care would sort of work together. And so maybe there's a ministry in the same church that's been working with kids in that neighborhood or something like that. And so it's a way of coming together to work together, to advocate for that and to broaden that ministry so that it's more effective and it's addressing multiple oppressions or injustices at the same time. Does that help? Does that make any sense?
No, I think that's very helpful, at least for me. Yes. No, I love the idea of, because I think there's so much emphasis, at least where I live now, on community gardens and having gardens where people are free to glean. But you're right. If you can't cook the food, we're missing a huge opportunity to extend that ministry and make it relevant to, the whole person, and also to connect. And I guess this is the other thing that I'm thinking about too, is as much as I care about, caring for humans, just to make that connection that it's also caring for creation, that, we want to provide, sustainable options and not just the leftovers from our pantries.
Sure. Yeah.
Or we're just feeding bees too. So while you're feeding, there's the rest of creation also that needs fed. And so that's another intersection. So it does it does wrap. Same thing about migration. So it's interesting when, migration is a human problem. It's also an animal problem. There is forced migration and climate refugee status going on with other populations. So why make them separate conversations? The causes are the same. So anyway, so that's where we start working on breaking down categories that are false. So we have created a lot of hunger in the animal world. The the lawns that sit there used to feed a lot of critters that we essentially kicked them off for our convenience. So just as we also kicked indigenous people off for our wealth, and we exploited others for the same, if we're going to repent, let's run the repentance all the way. There's the rest of God's beloved creation that we have also exploited, so we can start feeding them too. Anyway, that just to blend the conversations, right? I think is part of what I hear, where this is going.
Yeah, and always looking for ways to make those connections, to analyze it, to think about what is, and it's a way of drawing more energy into that work, instead of, because for me, that sending energy in two different directions, like that's just it puts me in a weaker position. But funneling multiple energies together creates more than the sum of its parts and is more renewing and energizing. And I think just ultimately more effective. It's a stronger position to be in. And I think it's because, as like what Joey referred to, that's how creation was made. It's interconnected. And so when we start to work in that way, it just goes better, because it's how we're supposed to do it. It's how God does it. So it's not all these, binaries and silos, and we send energy this way and that way and hope that something good happens.
Yeah.
And sometimes really great things happen, but I think even better things can happen and can be more joyful in the experience of them.
Martha, you had your hand up. You still want to jump in?
I could. I was spitting out a possibility. I was trying to answer the question that you were asked, Leanne.
Great.
And I too sort of came down on the food side. Recently, there's been a lot of publicity in Chicago, and I don't think Chicago's the only location where this has been true, about how COVID outcomes are so much worse for the Black and Brown communities for lots of different reasons. But one reason is because of food deserts, and also, well, that's one area that you can look at. And then if you look at, what are some of the worst foods that you can eat for like metabolic syndrome, let's say, which is like the collection of like traumas that are created by lifestyle disease issues. So one of the worst foods, of course, is meat for doing that. And then there's this that then makes the connection that meat is one of the strongest drivers to reduce climate change. I mean, it's 51. There's a recent report out. 51% of our emissions come from animal agriculture and how we organize that. And so then you start thinking about, okay, who would be the best folks to address this? And of course, there's this terrific movement right now among Black folk to be vegan and to liberate Black bodies from the oppression of how our food system is currently set up in this country. And I think, you could think of a beautiful vegan celebration that had to do both with healing Black and brown bodies while also, significantly cutting emissions, more so than, like, for example, buying an electric car, which many of my Black and brown neighbors can't afford at this point anyway. So, but so that would work together really well, and then you get folks that are interested in food justice working together with folks that are interested in eco justice, and yet having the same kind of program almost to solve both problems.
Right.
Yep. And that you used, Leanne, a term, the PIC, the prison industrial complex, and one of the motions is abolition, I guess, to defund and dismantle the industry, and the mythologies, I guess, that fuel the industry, right? That we can punish our way out of this, that criminality is a personal choice made in freedom, that
Right.
all of the mythologies that fuel the funding of the PIC. And I wonder if there's an environmental equivalent. So of course, one of them probably would be the petroleum industry, but another one might be
Factory
agricultural.
farms.
Yes. Yes.
And it's the how do you begin to dismantle the industrial side of agriculture? It's not agriculture that's a problem. It's industrial ag, and or something like that. And I'm not even sure that's a completely clean statement, because we are
No, but
feeding the
you're
world.
getting there. You're getting there.
Right. And so how do we start getting there is exactly right. And this is, and the reason I'm pulling this is to say it's the language in common that we need to start borrowing. They discovered this language is useful. They who work on the prison side have come upon some language that helps them get at the roots. And it's the same root, therefore, therefore to learn what they from them, right? To say in the environmental circle, to say this is the way they talk about it over there. Maybe we should be talking about it the same over here. Or of course, what we're saying is maybe over there and over here need to kind of be less here and there. But anyway, that.
Yeah. Margaret Bain says, I explained to the people in my congregation that one reason to restore our woodland is so that we can use it for spiritual retreats.
Yeah. And that's the love thing, gets at the love thing.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and
go ahead.
And then on top of that, you know, one of the things that they've found out by doing the research on human bodies is that the more trees you are close to, the less likely you are to get cancer. I mean, it's not a one-to-one correspondence for an individual person, but in the aggregate, if you are in a tree-lined street with with access to trees regularly, then you know there's this marvelous chemical, which is sort of like the exhalation of trees, that increases our T cells and reduces our cancer risk, and so. A lot of good research out of Japan on that. And so that mixes together in a really nice way.
And also for mental health.
Mm-hmm.
Mental health as well. There's not only trees, but spending time in nature. There's all kinds of studies that back that up as well. And we were having a mental health crisis in our country right now.
Yeah,
for sure.
And so I would ask, I would pose to Margaret. I'm looking for your face. There you are, Margaret. Okay, I see you now. Yeah. You could use it for spiritual retreats for the congregation, but you know, what about also creating an outdoor sanctuary for maybe some neighbors that may have intersectional, may be vulnerable to lots of intersectional injustice? Are there, you know, neighbors nearby who could use that space for renewal, for mental health support, for physical health? You know, and so that would be a way of doing both, an intersectional approach of caring for creation, for the habitat, and looking at ways of extending the community that benefits from that ministry. And it would be evangelistic. So even boom, you know, there you go.
Yeah, what's all that nature deficit do to those in prison and so on?
So I don't, I know we're going to wrap up in a minute here, but to get at what you were saying about the environmental equivalent of the PIC, and you know, I don't know if it's even equivalent or if it's just we need to think about the prison industrial complex as even larger than and broader, more complex. All right. So the detention center where my ministry and work was focused for 5 years, Irwin County Detention Center in South Central Georgia, is in a small town, an ag town, about 30 minutes from where I live in South Central Georgia. Big ag here, and I'm not anti, you know, ag, but because my husband's an ag researcher, so I'm in the middle of all of that community. But you know, we advocates eventually advocated and fought and finally exposed human rights abuses in that detention center, especially against women and who were receiving non-consensual gynecological procedures from an outside doctor. And maybe you remember this, and at Irwin. And so eventually Department of Homeland Security ordered the cancellation of the ICE contract for that facility. And so, you know, then there's the question of what happens to this rural community. It was that facility, they are dependent on that facility. It's a for-profit facility, for-profit contract. So it's funded by government contracts. So our tax dollars pay for it, but corporations profit. But also the local community, the county, depended on revenue from the detention center for basic operations in the county. And that's an extractive industry, extracting human labor, because most of the labor inside, like janitorial, kitchen, whatever, was performed voluntarily by detained persons for $1 a day. $1 a day. And they, and if they didn't have any other source of income to buy snacks or extra food or whatever they needed, they were pretty much forced to work. For $1 a day, they had to pay for stamps, phone calls, everything with that $1 a day. That's an extractive economy, and it's a slave economy, right? And so, but meanwhile, that community is also dependent on an extractive industrial agricultural system. And so it's just trying to think about what happens to those rural communities to transition them away from a carceral economy that they're dependent on and an industrial, like an extractive economy. And that's really difficult, and it certainly has happened in different places, but that's a big picture community development and investment in resources by the government, by agencies, by organizations to reimagine that community entirely. What would it look like, if this facility becomes a healthcare facility? What would it look like if agriculture shifts into sustainable ag, an actual food that you can eat and not so much commodity crops like, I mean, we do love our peanuts, and that's what my husband works. But anyway, but that just gives you an idea of, how some of this thinking, like what happens in these communities. And I'm really interested in exploring, what does that pathway look like to break free for the rural communities and the people who were forced to work in the detention center because there was no other viable employment in that community for them that they could actually support their families with. And they suffered moral injury, and they suffered physical injury, and some died during COVID because they were not given PPP. It's just, there's a lot to think about, but that's where, what does community look like? What does, when we transition away, and how can churches lead some of those community redevelopment, reimagination efforts?
And how can they see that as their mission and
Right.
germane to their mission and
Right.
for their reason for being? Yeah.
Okay. Thanks for letting me riff on that for a few minutes.
Indeed, and I can see in the
Thank you
chat
very
that we're
much.
getting. Yeah. Go ahead. Mary.
We have a couple of things in the chat before you wrap up. Lynn Leroy says, are our bodies intersectional? Nature is good for physical health and mental health. Few things are good for only one specific part of us. When you try to isolate any one thing in nature, you find that it is connected to everything in the universe. It seems that it is only our minds that compartmentalize. That's a really, yeah.
And our bodies aren't even ours, only a certain percentage
Right.
of it.
Yeah. And then Martha says, prisons and creatures. We imprison nature in small, unconnected pockets of state parks and conservation easements. To survive, we need to liberate creature by creating pathways. Oh, I love that. Over highways by combining the pockets into larger tracts, etc.
And so on. See, we're starting now we're getting into retreat mode. We could do this for a couple of days. So I'm putting out here the link to this page, which I'll show you just for a second, and then we'll let ourselves go. This is if you have not subscribed yet. So this link, deepgreenfaith.org contact is the place that you can get on the newsletter. We would be sending that out and letting you know what we're doing like next month and there's courses that will be showing up in the spring and so on and so forth. So if you haven't subscribed, we invite you to do so. And anything else for the good of the order before we have a good night? Thank you, Leeann. That was great stuff. Yep.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, you
you so
changed
much.
the conversation. Yeah.
Happy anniversary, Leeann, if I'm correct.
Oh,
about
thank you.
that.
Yeah, last week. Thank you.
All right.
Facebook. Yeah, just
Right.
well, blessings on you all and your ministries.
Yeah.
Appreciate it so much.
Thank you so much, Leeann. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Okay, everyone. Have a good night. Blessings on
Good
you as
night.
well.
Peace, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you too, Jerry.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you, Leanne.
You're welcome. Thank you for your time.
Okay. Yeah. So good. Let me stop recording. There we go.
I